Good afternoon, and thank you for tuning into this video. This is the second portion of the background and introductory material for the tribulation sequence of events. In my first video, I covered my division of Matthew chapter 24, as well as my method of interpreting the judgments of Revelation 6 through 16. In this video, we're going to cover my rejection of the parallel interpretation of Matthew 24 and Revelation 6, and my application of Revelation 16:13 and Daniel 12, verses 11 and 12. This here is the third reason why my results differ from what is currently being taught on radio, TV, etc. Let's look at the problem stated. The problem stated is here. Dr. Bogalski has an article on the Pre-Trib website. In both the title of his article and its opening sentences, he reveals not only the reason for the variety of interpretations of Matthew 24, as we discussed at the beginning of the other video, but also this key error. The title of the article is A Comparison of the Olivet Discourse and the Book of Revelation. His opening sentences read as follows. The purpose of this presentation is to demonstrate parallel events between the Olivet Discourse and the Book of Revelation in a sequential format. Correlation of each event of the Olivet Discourse with its timing in the Book of Revelation informs our understanding of the current age in regards to the signs of the end times or stage setting, and interpretation of the return of Christ and the judgments at that time. In other words, the overlapping method exists because commentators assume that just because Jesus is talking about the tribulation in Matthew 24, he must also be making specific references to the seals of Revelation 6. This assumption is the cause of the differing opinions regarding the division of Matthew 24. They can't agree on which verses apply to which seals. Let's look at some examples. Now here we have Clarence Larkin and Dr. Walvert's division of Matthew chapter 24 and its comparison with Revelation chapter 6. The point of comparison is this third column and this fourth column right here. Now you can see you have Larkin referring to the first seal in Matthew 24 verses 4 and 5, which Walvert does not have. Now they have the same verses for the second seal and the third seal, but the fourth seal is where things go differently. The fourth seal is verses 7 and 8 here. Walvert includes verse 9. And from the fifth seal onward, there is no similarities whatsoever. These two men, Clarence Larkin in 1919 and Dr. Walvert in the 1960s, could not agree on the division of Matthew chapter 24 and how the seals apply. Now, as previously mentioned, there is little agreement on the division and application of Matthew 24 based on the proper division of Matthew 24. That portion that refers to the first half of the 7 years, verses 7 and 8, is summed up in 3 words: conflict, famines, and earthquakes. There is insufficient information to declare a one-to-one relationship with the first 4 seals, let alone additional associations with the 5th and 6th seal. And this assumes that the common interpretation of the seals is correct. This leads to a second observation. If Jesus is making specific references to the seals, shouldn't he also be making specific references to the trumpets and vials? There is nothing in Matthew 24 that refers to the fire hail of the first trumpet, the asteroid strike of the second trumpet, the darkness of the fourth trumpet. And then moving to the vials, we don't have the boils of the first vial, the heat of the fourth vial, or the darkness of the fifth vial. The parallel interpretation of Matthew 24 and Revelation 6 is the key error behind the overlapping method of interpretation, and the reason why there is little agreement on the division of Matthew 24. For these reasons, all attempts to force together Matthew 24 and Revelation 6 are fully rejected. While both of these passages discuss the tribulation, they remain distinct witnesses. Excuse me. fourth reason that my results differ is my application of Revelation 16:13 and Daniel chapter 12 verses 11 and 12 to the tribulation timeline. The absences of these two verses in current interpretation are two errors of omission. The impact that these two passages have on our understanding of the tribulation is huge. Let's look at Revelation 16:13 and the devil's trinity. The first error of omission is the absence of Revelation 16:13 in identifying the evil leadership during the 7 years. Now, the impact of this error is twofold. There are three people, the devil's trinity, not just two. And there are two world rulers, and not just one. Let's look at Revelation 16:13 through 14a. And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, three unclean spirits like frogs, for they are the spirits of demons. Let's look at the current commentaries and see how they deal with the Antichrist. Let's look at the scriptures first. We have 4 verses here. 1 John 2:18, 2:22, 1 John 4:3, as well as 2 John 1:7. The word Antichrist is only used 4 times in the New Testament, and it's not in the book of Revelation. Now, oddly enough, commentators on the book of Revelation use the word Antichrist throughout their works. Their adherence to this word has caused a great deal of confusion. From the 4 verses listed right here on this chart, we learn that there is a specific person called Antichrist who is coming at some point in the future, but there is also a spirit, or what we would call today a worldview, that is called Antichrist. Those who have this worldview, they deny the Father and the Son. They deny that Jesus is the Christ. They deny that Jesus is from God. And they deny that Jesus came in the flesh. Let's look at the current confusion. This myopic focus on the word Antichrist has caused a great deal of confusion. Now, Pentecost quotes a commentator by the name of Pink, who has a list of names and titles for the Antichrist. And Pentecost quotes this on page 334 of his book, Things to Come. This list shows that an excessive focus on the word Antichrist has caused commentators to completely miss that there are other individuals active during the tribulation. Daniel 7, verses 7 and 8, requires that there be at least 7 other little horns, i.e. leaders during the tribulation. Also, there are 6 references to kings of the earth in the book of Revelation. Let's look at this first example right here. In an example of this confusion, Pink's list includes both the prince of Daniel 9:26 and the desolator of 9:27, as both being the Antichrist. Now, it is impossible for these to be the same person. The one signs the covenant at the beginning of the tribulation, while the other rises in the middle of the tribulation. A second example. Pentecost equates the beast of Revelation 13:1 through 10 with the prince of Daniel 9:26. Then he states that the Assyrian is another person, and he does this on page 353 of his Things to Come. This is the quote. He writes, "This scourge could hardly be the occupation of the beast, for he was a party of the covenant, but must refer to the invasion by the Assyrian who will be used by the Lord to chasten Israel." This is the exact same problem that Walvoord solved by declaring that the rider of the first seal is the first beast of Revelation 13, at which point Walvoord then moved all of the judgments into the last half of the 7 years. There are, on the positive side, some things that are correct. Both Pink and Pentecost recognize that the desolator of Daniel 9:27 is a second person and not the statue that is called the abomination of desolation. That statue is in Revelation 13. Now, one wonders if they realized that they had just disassociated Matthew 24:15 from Daniel 9:27. Now, this issue will be addressed in the next section, and it's very important. Pentecost writes, "In the middle of the week, great persecution will break out because of the desolator." And on the very next page he writes, "Inasmuch as it was known that only 7 years would intervene between the beginning of this period and the coming of the Messiah, or 3.5 years, from the appearance of the desolator to Messiah's advent." Now, unfortunately, in his immediate context, Pentecost has already associated the prince with the Antichrist, and therefore he is incapable of properly identifying the desolator as the Antichrist, the beast. Now let's look at the revised instruction. While the word Antichrist is not in the book of Revelation, there is a key verse, and we mentioned it earlier, Revelation 16:13, that tells us that there are 3 evil human beings who are possessed by unclean spirits, demons. The biblical names for these are dragon, beast, and false prophet. One of these people is possessed by the devil himself, the dragon. Now, this possession does not occur until the middle of the 7 years, when the devil is finally and fully cast out of heaven, which occurs in Revelation 12, verses 7 through 9. The devil is discussed in Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, and I especially like Isaiah 27:1. All of these verses are eschatological, but none of them provide any clues as to which human he is indwelling at the time of Revelation 16, verses 13 and 14. Now, the second one of these humans must be of Assyrian descent, based on Isaiah 31:8, Isaiah 10:24, and Micah 5, verses 5 through 6. This is the first beast of Revelation 13. He's the Antichrist. While he demands to be worshipped, he worships and directs everyone else to worship the dragon who gave him his authority. The beast is technically second in charge. And third, the false prophet must be of Jewish descent in order for him to be acceptable in Israel. This agrees with the picture of him coming up out of the earth in Revelation 13, verses 11 to 18. Now, he will likely claim to be the Elijah that they have been waiting for. It is probably not a coincidence that the specific miracle mentioned in Revelation 13:13, that is, the fire from heaven, mirrors one of Elijah's greatest miracles in 2 Kings 1, verses 10 to 12. But it's important also to remember that the devil has also previously performed this miracle in Job 1, verse 16. When looking at these 3 people, it is equally important to remember that religious Jews are waiting for 2 people, a Messiah and an Elijah. The devil provides an anti-Messiah and a false Elijah. Another passage that helps clarify this issue is Revelation 17, verses 10 and 11. It clearly states that there will be 2 world rulers during the 7 years. The first that will remain a little while during the first half, and the other who goes to destruction rules during the second half. Let's look at that verse. "And there are 7 kings. 5 have fallen and 1 is. The other has not yet come. When he comes, he must remain for a little while. And the beast which was and is not is himself also an 8th, and is of the 7, and he goes to destruction." The prince of Daniel 9:26 is the 7th ruler. And the desolator of Daniel 9:27 is the 8th, the beast. The prince signs the covenant on the earth while the devil is still in heaven. The beast and the devil are both on the earth during the second half. The beast is the 8th ruler who goes to destruction. But we also know from other passages he is identified in a similar fashion. Not only does he go to destruction, in Daniel 7, verse 11, he is the little horn given to the burning fire. In Daniel 8:23, he is the king who will be broken without human agency. In Isaiah 31:8, he is the Assyrian who will fall by a sword not of man. And in Revelation 19:20, he is the beast who is thrown alive into the lake of fire. Now, while most of you will have difficulty with the idea that there are two sequential rulers during the tribulation, it is interesting to note that some commentators have recognized for nearly 100 years that there are two sequential world capitals, Rome and Babylon. Now, Clarence Larkin observes that the Antichrist destroys Mystery Babylon, Rome, at the beginning of his rule, and he writes, "This will occur at the time that the worship of the beast is set up. For the Antichrist, in his jealous hate, will not permit any worship that does not center on himself." On the same page, using the imagery of Revelation 17, he also notes that the Pope cannot be the Antichrist. He writes, "The beast upon which the woman sits is introduced to show from whom the woman, that is the papal church, gets her power and support after the true church has been caught out. And also to show that the beast, the Antichrist, and the woman are not one and the same but separate. Therefore, the papacy is not the Antichrist." Clarence Larkin's comment here may very well be directed at Alexander Hislop's book, The Two Babylons, that was originally published in 1858. Alexander Hislop traced false religions from Genesis 11 through to the Catholic Church, and in it he strongly argued that the Pope is the Antichrist. Walvoord also recognizes that there are two sequential world capitals. The revived Roman Empire, he writes, "The revived Roman Empire, which will be in sway immediately after the rapture of the church, is apparently indicated by the seventh head, while the beast, described in verse 11, as the eighth, is the world empire, which is destroyed by Jesus Christ at his second coming." Now he also writes, "It is also conceivable that Rome might be the capital in the first half of the last 7 years, and Babylon the capital in the second half, in the world empire phase." Knowing that the recognition of two world capitals has been around for so long, we can reasonably ask why there is such a strong adherence to the idea of a single 7-year world ruler, a single 7-year Antichrist. Now, under current interpretation, the Roman Antichrist destroys his own first capital, Rome, in the middle of the tribulation because he hates it, and then moves to Babylon. And the destruction of that is in Revelation 17, verses 15 to 18. The second error of omission is the absence of Daniel 12, 11, and 12 when dividing the 7 years. Again, the impact of this error is also twofold, because there are 3 divisions of time within the 7 years and not 2. And the Great Tribulation is only the last 44 days and not the entire second half, 3.5 years. Let's look at Daniel 12, verses 11 and 12. "And from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1335th day." Now, the current instruction on the link between Matthew 24:15 and Daniel 9:27. We'll come back to Daniel 12, 11, and 12 in just a moment. The link between Matthew 24:15 and Daniel 9:27 is the key to the current division of the 7 years into 2 equal halves. Excuse me. Commentators claim that Jesus' reference to the abomination of desolation, which is the talking statue of Revelation 13, verses 14 and 15, is a reference to the desolator who comes on the wing of abomination in Daniel 9:27. This link makes the desolator the statue. From this, they also claim that the Great Tribulation is the entire second half of the 7 years. Now, for those of you who are unaware of why the tribulation is currently divided into two equal halves, this is it. It's the link between Matthew 24:15 and Daniel 9:27, and the assumption that the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24:15 is the desolator of Daniel 9:27. This is also why I specified a moment ago that when Pentecost recognized that the desolator was a person, he just disassociated those two verses. Pentecost writes, while all would agree on the basis of Daniel 9:27 and Matthew 24:15 and Revelation 13 that the week is divided into two parts of 3 1/2 years each. And Dr. Walvoord writes, the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away is equated with the abomination that maketh desolate. This expression originating in the revelation of Daniel 9:27 has reference to the stopping of sacrifices in the middle of the 7-year period. The problem with this link is that the phrase abomination of desolation from Matthew 24:15 is not found in Daniel 9:27. The phrase wing of abomination, which is in Daniel 9, it's not even close. Let's take a look at the correct link. Jesus' reference to the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24:15 is a quote, a direct quote, from Daniel 12 verses 11 and 12. Those verses are Matthew 24:15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet. And Daniel 12:11 and 12 says, and from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1290 days. How blessed is he who waits for and attains to the 1335th day. When Daniel 9:24 through 27 and Daniel 12:11 and 12 are combined, they provide a very specific picture of Israel's last 7 years. Now we know from the idea of the prophetic year that the 7 years are exactly 2,520 days long. That's 360 days per year times 7 years. But this is divided. We have first, there are 1,186 days from the signing of the covenant to the termination of the sacrifice. There are 1,290 days from the termination of the sacrifice to the placement of the abomination of desolation. And the final 44 days are the Great Tribulation over here at the very end. Now, if you're wondering, you'll notice I said 1,334 days. That's because the 1,335th day is the first day of the millennium. Now that we've seen how Daniel 12:11 and 12 is used in the corrected instruction, we need to look at how the current commentators handle the numbers in these passages, because they do recognize them and they do try to deal with them, although not very well. Both Walvoord and Larkin teach that the extra 30 days from 1260 to 1290 and the extra 75 days from 1260 to 1335, they keep that split in the middle of the tribulation, that they project these extra days into the millennium and are needed by Jesus to set up the kingdom. And I've put my chart here with the 5 years, with the 7 years ending here, and this is how they add the extra ones. They push them into the millennium. This errs on two accounts. First, the duration of the tribulation is fixed at 2,520 days. To project these into the millennium for any reason violates this duration. That is why there is an overlap of 74 days with the first half. These 1,334 days from the sacrifice at the beginning of the millennium must fit within the total duration of 2,520 days. The second error is this. They suggest that Jesus needs time to set up the kingdom. Now, it is important to realize, especially here, that we're talking about two different kingdoms. We have the kingdom of the world and the millennial kingdom for Israel. At the seventh trumpet, Jesus receives the kingdom of the world, which means he recovers all that was usurped from Adam. And he uses the first 44 days of his kingdom, which is the last 44 days of Israel's 7-year tribulation, to judge and prepare the world for the millennial kingdom that was promised to Israel. The millennial kingdom then starts on time, on the first day after the tribulation. The millennial kingdom only lasts 1,000 years, but Jesus' kingdom never ends. Now you can see this seventh trumpet in Daniel 7 verses 13 through 14, Revelation 11, 15 through 19, and Revelation 15, 2 through 4. And there are two assumptions that are a major part of current interpretation. The first is a subtle assumption that pervades modern interpretation. This assumption is that any reference to 1,260 days, 42 months, or times on halftime, that they must refer to either the first half or the second half of the 7 years exactly. Their reasoning is that this length of time is half of 7 years, therefore it must be either the first half or the second half exactly, and that it can't drift back and forth. Now from this they teach that the extra days mentioned in Daniel 12, 11, and 12 must extend past the end of the 7 years. The second assumption concerns the word middle in Daniel 9:27. Modern commentators assume that this word means exact middle. This assumption interacts with the timing references in Revelation where 1,260 days are specified, and is in part why many assume that the fulfillment must be either the first half or the second half exactly. When the numbers of Daniel 12, 11, and 12 are factored in, the word middle is early by only 74 days, which is less than 3%. So let's summarize the first video and this second video. This is the entire 7 years, 2,520 days. It is important that we get this number from Daniel 9 and not from the book of Revelation. If we get this number by adding 1260 and 1260, we're falling into that trap of I previously described by assuming that they are exactly first half and exactly second half. Let's look at the location of the judgments. Seals 1 through 5 are in the green on this far left over here. They are opened within days or less at the beginning of the 7 years, and I would even suggest within the first 24 hours. The sixth seal through the sixth trumpet occur during the remainder of the first half, plus 3.5 days, right here. There are no judgments during the majority of the second half because God's witnesses have been killed and resurrected. The seventh trumpet, the seventh vials, and the return of Jesus all occurred during the last 44 days, right over here at the very end. Global rulers. Revelation 17 tells us that there are two global rulers during the tribulation, a seventh and an eighth. Daniel 9 verses 26 and 27 identifies these two rulers as the prince and the desolator. The desolator of Daniel 9 is the beast of Revelation 13, 1 through 10, the Antichrist. This is the Antichrist. The prince signs the covenant that initiates the tribulation and then later terminates the sacrifice. The beast receives global authority 30 days after the sacrifice is terminated, which is still 44 days before the exact middle of the 7 years. Revelation 13:10 tells us that the beast has authority for 42 months. His reign ends 44 days early, before the end of the 7 years. And Revelation chapter 11, verses 15 through 19 tells us that his reign ends at the 7th trumpet. Jesus and the beast cannot have the same authority at the same time. Let's look at protected witnesses. Based upon their ministry task, which is to restore all things, the 2 witnesses must minister during the first half when there is a temple. Protected worship, 42 months. From Revelation chapter 11, verse 2, we learn that the 7-year covenant includes permission for Israel to institute biblical temple worship. Temple worship is during the first half and coincides with the ministry of the 2 witnesses. We can assume that this 42 months starts with the signing of the covenant. Now, unless the document itself specifies a later date for the start of the covenant, this would be an international agreement. People have to come together, agree what it means, sign it, and then determine when it takes effect. It would take time also, whether it's weeks or months, to build the temple or tabernacle. Now, even now in 2019, we know that the religious Jews in the temple worship group, they are the Temple Institute, they are ready. They've got an altar, they've got the brazen altar, they've got the priesthood train, they've got the red heifer. They're ready to go. They just need the building. Now, this verse does not mention, that is Revelation 11:2. It does not mention the daily sacrifice. Only the Gentiles have access to the court outside the temple. All temple worship is terminated at the end of 42 months, which is the exact middle of the 7 years. I went ahead and included this one. The prince terminates the sacrifice 74 days before all temple worship is terminated, and 30 days before the beast receives global authority. And finally, we looked at the protected Israelites. This slide here. This slide shows the group of Israelites who are protected for the 1260 days. Now, Jesus returns several days before the end. Now, this gives the surviving Israelites time to conquer the surrounding nations, as per prophecy in the book of Isaiah, before the millennium begins. This means that this 1260 days of protection could end just after the Battle of Armageddon. Now, this would allow the protected ones to join the rest of the survivors in their conquering. Now, this would move the beginning of their protection several days earlier, just before the beginning of the 7 years and the death of the 2 witnesses. Final summary. In this video, we've covered the background material for the tribulation sequence of events that will be covered in future videos. There are 4 reasons why my sequence of events will differ from current instruction. We have my division of Matthew 24 and my method of interpreting the judgments of Revelation 6 to 16 discussed in the first video. My division of Matthew 24 is taken straight from the text, and I have not tried to import anything from the book of Revelation to do that. My method of interpreting the judgments of Revelation 6 through 16 is a purely sequential interpretation that recognizes, and this is important, it recognizes that the 7th seal and the 7th trumpet, they have their own specific events, and they're not just representative of everything that comes afterwards. And in this video, we discussed my rejection of the parallel interpretation of Matthew 24 and Revelation 6. This is taking the Antichrist, war, famine, and death of the first 4 seals and trying to put them back into Matthew 24. Current commentators do that, and that's why they can't agree on the division of Matthew 24 and why they arrange and interpret the judgments the way that they do. And finally, my application of Revelation 16:13 and Daniel 12:11 and 12. The devil's trinity has 3, and they're all active on the earth during the second half of the tribulation. The dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. But out of this, we also learn that there are 2 global rulers and not just one. We have a Roman prince, and we have an Assyrian beast, an Assyrian Antichrist. And from Daniel 12, 11, and 12, we learned that the 7 years for Israel is divided into 3 sections, not 2. We have the first 1186 days up until the sacrifice is terminated, 1290 days, followed by the last 44 days. I want to thank you for tuning in and watching this video. My next video will begin the tribulation sequence proper. Thank you.